My name is Tracy Norton, and I am Tessa's co-editor on the book. And so I guess I'm the co-conferencer as well. So we are now at panel 3, Designing the Law Course of the Future. And this panel is also going to be a Q&A panel. And I want to introduce quickly all of the panelists. As you can see, we have quite a lot of panelists for this one. And so this is going to be pretty brisk and engaging, I hope. So we have with us Megan Best from UIC John Marshall School of Law. Where's Megan? No. Hey, there she is. We have Kate Brim from University of Houston Law Center, my old stomping grounds. Veronica C. Gonzalez Zamora from University of New Mexico School of Law. We have Audrey Freed from Osgood Hall School of Law. Joy Hare Cardillo from University of Arizona James Rogers College of Law. Carrie Lohmeyer from University of Utah College of Law. Tony Maselli from St. Louis University School of Law. And my colleague Ann Nowak from Toro College Jacob D. Fuchsberg Law Center. And so they have all written chapters on designing. Oh, and Vicki Sutton. I'm so sorry, Vicki. And Vicki Sutton from another of my old stomping grounds, Texas Tech School of Law. So this panel authored a number of chapters on designing the law course of the future. And so let's get right into that. So before we start with the questions for all of the panelists, I'd like to ask Vicki to sort of frame this for us by telling us what should we be thinking about in terms of researching designing the course of the future as we learn about how to design the courses.
Okay, thank you, Tracy, and good to be here with everyone. I've enjoyed the panel so far today. It's been great. One of the things that I believe firmly in, and which is the subject of my chapter, is we really need to build a body of knowledge of research in online teaching and learning for legal education. We know there's a lot out there for undergrad, but there really hasn't been a lot for legal education. And legal education is kind of like the last frontier for online education because we've had lots of pushback because it doesn't fit with our Socratic method and so forth. And one of the ways that you can be heard about the benefits and the differences and the advantages of online learning is to have evidence-based decision-making. And to do that, doing good research, doing surveys, making assessments of how successful online teaching is really critical. So I encourage everyone to team up with a quantitative social scientist or to design your own surveys for your own use. But publishing is always a great thing too. That adds to our body of knowledge. And also, unlike legal education or legal publishing in science, you want to go see what everybody else has done in legal online learning research, and you want to cite to that. And in that way, it builds on existing knowledge where you can say, oh, I got the same result or I got a different result from X study. So working along with, as you design your course, design some questions. For example, I know a very common question would be, how well did assignment X help you understand the material? Now you can get some really interesting information from that. Another really good kind of question is a comparative question. How did your preparation time compare to your preparation time in a face-to-face class? And then you have something to describe to your colleagues when they say, maybe I don't think they do X. And then you have something actually empirical to use in your arguments. And I will just add that sometimes the loudest voice in the room, the squeaky wheel, always gets to be the one that leads the decision-making for law school. And you can counter this by actually having very good evidence base. based reasons for what you're doing. So that's my pitch. And remember, if you want to publish it, you have to get clearance from your institutional review board. And that's my pitch. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks, Vicki. That was, I heard Vicki talk about this a couple of years ago at the Denver conference, and my big takeaway from that was before you launch your survey or your instrument, make sure you've got your IRB approval, because if you get your IRB approval after you've got your instrument out in the field, you can't use it. All right, so here we go with questions about designing courses. So the first question is, how has designing courses for online delivery changed how you think about teaching in a physical classroom now that many of us are going back in the fall? And so, Audrey, what would you say?
Thank you very much, Tracy. Designing for online delivery has really forced us, I think, to be more mindful about how we design our courses. And in particular, using some of the frameworks for designing online courses like the community of inquiry has really highlighted the importance of considering not just how students are interacting with our content and our material, but also how they're going to interact with each other and with us. So I think adapting to an online environment forces us to notice how much of the learning experience really depends on nonverbal communication and casual or incidental interactions, and that we just have when we're in person. So because much of this is lost when we moved online, we've had to really intentionally design ways for our students to get to know each other, build trust, and ultimately to create opportunities for them to work and learn together. So for example, rather than relying on students getting to know each other just by incidentally chatting while they're waiting for the classroom doors to open or while they're waiting in line to get coffee at a break, we might want to intentionally create spaces for them to casually interact or to do icebreaker activities. And we may also want to facilitate study groups or assign collaborative work, a think, pair, share activity, or having students do collaborative annotation, that kind of thing. And we've also had to design ways to check in on our students and see how they're doing instead of just relying on nonverbal cues that we almost unconsciously pick up on when we're teaching in person. So just their body language telling us whether they're paying attention, if they're confused, if they're excited. So instead, we may have to use things like polls or 1-minute papers to ask students, should we be moving on to the next topic? Do we need to go over it again? We might want to test them for their understanding or collect feedback or opinions. And I think in many cases, these intentional practices, which were meant to compensate for some of the difficulties of online learning, will be really beneficial to continue in our in-person courses. And at the same time, I think we're also going to want to incorporate some of the benefits of the online medium in our physical classrooms. And I know some of the other panelists have talked about some of the benefits. So we might want to host speakers on Zoom who otherwise wouldn't be able to come to our classes. And we may want to continue to create opportunities for students to collaborate using technology, to have those deep learning experiences that can really result from thoughtful asynchronous interactions, or support iterative work products, or have authentic audiences like community members or experts come in and give our students feedback on the work that they're doing.
Thank you. Tony, what about you? How has this changed how you think about teaching in the physical classroom?
Thank you, Tracy. So I am in the area of academic skills and bar exam preparation. And so for me, one of the pieces that I felt I kind of had taken for granted, even though I thought I was doing some work in it, I discovered that when I was switching to the online classroom, I was much more intentional in learning about best practices for universal design than I had ever been before. And so I feel like when we made this shift to the online piece and so much of our material became PDFs and PowerPoints, and we really weren't using the blackboard behind us anymore, all of a sudden it became much more important for me to make sure that that was going to be accessible. And in learning about accessibility and universal design, I was able to therefore make my PowerPoints and handouts more accessible to all of my students, not just some of my students. And that's something that I know I can take back into the classroom and that I can continue to do. It ended up actually even informing what font we chose for a book that we published this last year, because all of a sudden it mattered more that people could use it, right? And so that was really a great piece for me. I think the other piece was learning the value of on-demand content and learning how much that affects accessibility for some students. Especially, we have a part-time evening program. We have a daytime part-time program that is made up primarily of students who have families that they're working around family schedules. And so learning that in creating a lot of on-demand programming, which I did for convenience of students during the pandemic, that's something that I'm going to continue to do, because again, it makes my content more accessible to all of my students, just no matter their background or their work schedules or anything like that. And so we actually moved our academic resource center online during the pandemic, because all of a sudden they weren't coming into a building, they couldn't borrow a supplement off the shelf. And so we connected the students to online supplements that we have subscriptions to, and yet the students had no idea they were there, right? We were paying for them. They didn't know they were there. They started utilizing those. We were able to connect them to a lot of the information that they always had to come into the resource center to get a handout on or to ask a question, finding those common questions that I'm answering over and over and creating handouts, putting those online, making the information accessible whenever a student needs it, whether it's for a class or for something more general like bar exam applications. And so I feel like what was a stopgap during the pandemic is something that really will serve our students and our just in general community as we move forward. Another piece was that I feel like online teaching somewhat unveiled even more how our students have growing time management and distraction issues than ever before. I think we all knew it was there, but we didn't fully appreciate how much it was there until we ourselves were suffering through it, right? And also, all of a sudden, we were worried when they had their camera on even what they were looking at, because you knew it wasn't you, right? And so we knew that was happening in a classroom, but when they were in our class and also not just necessarily ordering something on Amazon, but had kids, had families. I mean, you saw their home life in a way that we never have. And this curtain was kind of pulled back on a number of students who in any other year, I wouldn't have understood what else was going on outside of law school for them. And so that ability to connect with students really helped me appreciate how much more I might want to get to know my students than I already was prior to the pandemic, so that I can better, again, support them and help them with some of these time management decisions, and also how to deal with distractions. I had ironically been going on sabbatical at that beginning of the semester, and then I had my 2 young children come home instead. And so I had this pile of books I was going to read, including Atomic Habits, which I still chuckle at because I finally got to reading it last month. And there are so many pieces in that book and a number of other books that I've finally gotten through that deal with these distractions that we're able to incorporate into our smaller one-on-one conversations with students, if not our larger classes. And so that, I think, is another piece that will continue forward, because that's not changing even though we're going back to the classroom. And I think also, just like was said by the prior panelist, really incorporating the benefits of the online classroom. I learned some great screen capture software options that I can now walk students through websites. I can walk them through processes that I used to have to do one-on-one and make videos and post them for my students. And I'm much more willing to flip the classroom than I was before I went offline as well. I just finished this morning even planning out one of our courses for this semester. And we're so much more interested in engaging the students and practicing and applying in class now. Let them get the lecture piece outside, right? Let's do the fun stuff in class. And so I think that there's a lot more opportunity to continue forward with some of these pieces now that we're back in the classroom.
Wonderful. Thank you. Joy, what about you? What are you taking back into the physical classroom?
Well, I think this is a perfect segue for me, because I was going to comment that before COVID, I had already moved to a flipped classroom. I adapted team-based learning for the last couple of years before we went into lockdown. And I was really struck by how adaptable team-based learning was to an online environment. But one of the things about it in the past, when we were in an in-person classroom, we just kind of assigned the readings and assigned that out-of-class work with the hope that then students would come and feel the pressure of working in their teams to make sure that they actually did complete the work before they came to class. But when we went to the online environment, I found that our learning management system really gave me a ton of tools to sort of make that more accountable. The students had to complete one assignment in order to release their quiz for the individual part of the quiz, and they would complete that before class, and then they would be able to come into class and take the group quiz. And so having that ability to really ensure that the students were preparing and not just rely upon, I guess, good faith, I really appreciated that. I felt like the whole process was just more effective. I just really felt the level of preparation in the students was great. I also had just complete new appreciation for the learning management system. Prior to COVID, I had just kind of treated it like a place to park assignments or to, provide notice to students or links to Google Docs. But over last summer, I just completely redesigned my class site to really make it so it was like a home base for the course. So the students could, at every module, see, okay, these are the learning objectives. This is what, the outcomes are going to be. So I spelled all this stuff that used to be and is still on the syllabus, but I just duplicated it. So it's right there. And all the assigned reading is right there. When they open up the module for that class, everything is at their fingertips. And so it was just, I just felt like the whole structure of the course was very obvious to the students. And of course, to get it set up that way, I had to be very thoughtful and mindful about, okay, what are we covering in this unit? What are my goals and objectives? And so I think it just made me, even though we'd always done a lot of front-end planning with team-based learning, it really required a little bit more thoughtfulness and discipline on my part. So I'm going to continue to keep having the students really, use that as the base of the course, continue to do their individual quizzes online before we come into class. But I am looking forward to hopefully being in the classroom and being able to go back to scratch off sheets for the group quizzes.
Thanks, Joy. Me too. Kate?
So I just echo so much of what everyone else has just said. And I'm particularly fond of Joy when she said, I use my learning management system as a place to park assignments. I noticed there's been some commentary in the chat about that as well. And so it's opened a whole new world to me. So I really pile on to what everyone else has said. I'm really interested, however, in what Audrey said to begin, which is it really made me think about my course and its course structure intentionally. And it made me realize what a bad teacher I've been over the course of the past 12 years, or at least for part of that time. I think what I realized is because of COVID, I had to go in and really reevaluate not just the manner in which I was teaching, but what I was teaching. It sort of forced me to look at that. And I think from here forward, I will always, maybe one course a year, set aside a time to go through and think about what am I teaching, and is what I'm teaching stale? Is the way in which I'm teaching it stale? Do I need to upgrade some things? I'm embarrassed to tell you that for the last 12 years, I have gleefully taught objective writing using a big, long memo like we did, in 2000. And, all of a sudden it sort of forced me, or at least gave me the opportunity, this transition to the online classroom, to see that that's not necessarily the way in which people are teaching objective writing or should be teaching objective writing, because, law firms don't function that way. And anymore. Most everything is done in much shorter pieces, or even if they're going to do a memo, it's a shorter memo. So I was able to reevaluate my learning objectives. And then once I did that, I was also able to take a look at the way in which I was teaching and assessing these things. So I kind of updated my objectives, and then I looked at some of the many wonderful things that you guys have just spoken about, and that I'm sure we'll continue to talk about as the panel goes on, about how best to impart information to students. I really learned to appreciate the benefits of peer editing, which I'd never used before. So that's one way in which I was able to sort of decrease some of my grading load, but also really improve the students' learning experience. Not only did their own writing improve, but through sort of guided peer editing exercises that I was able to do through a piece of software I use called Eli Review. And now I learn that I can get sort of their competitor for free on my learning management system, which I had no idea about until just recently. But I can use these sorts of software learning activities, for lack of a better term, to really improve the way the students are learning and the way in which I'm able to assess them. I think those are the things that I take away. I've got a list of some of my favorite tools, and I'll be happy to drop that into chat just for you to see. But, I kind of really, I could go on and on, but I'll stop soon, Tracy, I promise. I really learned the value of sort of oral commentary. My students, 20 years ago, they didn't love oral commentary or would have just died to have me in their ear listening to, me go through their comments on their papers. But my students now really appreciate that. So I started using Loom and did oral commentary on papers to explain. So I'd go through and write my comments on a paper, but kind of in shorthand, and then I'd go through and explain them all. And my students, many times they listened to these 4 and 5 times, which was shocking to me. But in any event, it really made me update a whole lot of what I was doing and realized that I probably needed to continue to do that on sort of a rolling basis.
Thanks, Kate. That's fantastic. Our next question is, what were your thoughts about online legal education before emergency remote teaching was required in spring 2020? And what are your thoughts about online legal education now? And so we're going to start with Ann Nowak.
Thanks, Tracy. This is a question I love to talk about, and I promise I'll keep within my time limit. But I have a different perspective from probably most everybody watching this. And that's because I began teaching online about 15 years ago, way before the pandemic. It was before I was at Toro. I was practicing law full time. I thought, gee, I'd like to teach. Discovered that the University of Phoenix was looking for instructors in their Axia College division. It was the 2-year feeder school to University of Phoenix. It was asynchronous online. I applied, I got accepted. They would not let any of us start teaching until they trained us rigorously for 4 weeks. And it was really like boot camp for training. I'm very grateful for that. But it was their learning, again, around 15 years ago, where I learned how to create community in an online class, in an asynchronous class. That informed how I taught in a regular classroom, a brick and mortar classroom. It informed how I taught later on at Toro synchronously. So I moved to Toro. And if you want to, if you read my chapter, there's a funny experience that I outline there about how I learned how to create community at Axia College. But anyway, so I went to Toro, and about 8 years ago, Toro decided to start offering some synchronous courses. And there were, I think, 3 of us at the time who were the intrepid pioneers in that. I was one, Tracy was one, and there was one other person. And at University of Phoenix, where we had 24-hour tech support. So when my Excel spreadsheet that the school gave me for grading did not work at 1 a.m, I could call somebody live who was in Denver who'd help me. At Toro, we didn't have any specific tech support. We were teaching on Adobe Connect. Our tech department wasn't real familiar with it. So we were doing basically a high wire act. And I would call Tracy frantically, or Jack Graves was the other person who did this at Toro. I'd call them frantically and say, I don't know what to do. My students don't have bandwidth. I'm seeing purple stripes. What do I do? And so this was live synchronous. And I was teaching law practice management. So the tech was what was challenging. So now we were coming into the pandemic. And although I was terrified of COVID, I was really happy that I had this down teaching online, that I got to not have an hour commute each way and I could teach in my yoga pants or my pajama bottoms and fuzzy socks. And I was so happy. I taught everybody else how to do this. My teaching assistants, though, upper level students had also been teaching on Zoom for a couple of years to our evening students who never had time. I had the writing center at Toro. And evening students never had time to come in and get writing help. But when we went on to Zoom a couple of years before the pandemic, we discovered that that was a very useful tool. So how do I feel now? My thoughts about legal education now? I think I'm so happy that just about everybody's familiar with doing this online. And I'm not out in the Wild West trying to figure out the technology.
Thanks, Anne. Joy, what about you? What's your before and after?
Well, I would have to say before I was a complete and total snob about it. I was convinced online learning couldn't be as rigorous as in-person instruction, that it was impersonal and that students would just phone it in. And I was 100% wrong. I was so pleasantly surprised with my experience. I couldn't get over how committed the students were and how willing they were to just make the best of the situation. I mean, nobody was happy about the fact that we couldn't be in person, but the students were very engaged. And again, I think a lot of my experience does stem from the fact that the team-based learning and using the breakout rooms really was so effective in the online environment. So my classes are about 30 students, but I divide them into teams, 6 teams of about 5 students, 4 to 5 students. And every class, they go into their teams. So we might spend a little time as a big group, and then they go into their breakout rooms, and I'm bopping around through their breakout rooms. And they were able to establish relationships in those teams. And several students told me at the end of that first semester that this class, our class, had really been made such a difference for their first semester of law school, because some of the bigger classes where it was a lecture format, they really weren't able to meet their fellow students, but they had really formed bonds within their teams. And I also found that my own ability to develop relationships with my students was much better than I would have expected. The individual conferences add me to the chorus of people who say, I will continue to meet with students over Zoom, because the flexibility it gave for students who maybe were out of state or students who had young children. And for me, I'm not a person, by 5 o'clock, I want to be home. And so it was really nice to be able to, I can meet with you this evening and do it from home. So I really liked so many of those benefits. And I love that we can carry those with us as we go forward, even back into in-person class. So.
Thanks, Joy. Kate, what about you? What's your before and after on online learning?
So not to once again echo Joy, but the truth is I'm going to echo Joy because I was a complete snob about, make sure. Oh, good. I forgot to unmute myself, but apparently I never did mute me again. Sorry. I was a complete snob about online teaching and thought it was just a terrible thing to do. And having made the change, number one, I realized that it's useful for so many different things that I hadn't ever really anticipated. And number two, let's talk about those. I think back to what Tony said earlier about our part-time students. We at Houston have a big part-time program, and it made me realize not just for our part-time students, but for any students who are working, kind of a thorough online course catalog can really open up school in a way that nothing else can. And the courses are solid. They're good courses. In many, many respects, they're significantly better designed than some of our face-to-face courses, at least were in the past. And so I think that's a really big issue. I also am mindful that it's useful to reach out to some other students who may kind of get lost in the shuffle of law school. I know one of our colleagues at Oregon, Liz Frost, has developed a course specifically for targeted students that they identify at the end of the first year who are having trouble with kind of legal reading and legal writing skills. So they identify them early. These students, if they're going to school during the day or hopefully working during the day of that summer right after first year, they can work on their own time in an asynchronous course that is intended to help them improve these schools, which will not only help them in the immediate future, but for the rest of law school, and hopefully identify and take care of some of our students that do end up with kind of academic success issues and bar passage issues. So I think that's one way that we can reach them. Another thing that I think, and I promise that I'll stop talking soon, but one other thing that I think is a lot of my courses that are face-to-face, there are some modules for those courses that simply work better in an asynchronous environment. And I can't remember who it was, but one of you earlier was talking about that. I can teach research in an asynchronous environment, and my students can go one-on-one and do the things that they need to do. And then I can practice those skills in class, and we can actually talk about them, do group work, have interaction once they've kind of learned the basics. And not just in legal research and writing, but I teach an evidence course. And I found myself last year going and teaching, the two hardest things for students to learn are character evidence and hearsay. I set those two modules apart as asynchronous modules. And then when we got into the classroom, the students have a base familiarity with these very complicated rules. And we practiced using them in kind of real world situations. So I think that's something I never realized before I was forced to go online, and I'll never let that go.
Thanks, Kate. Tony, what about you?
So again, coming from the bar prep world, I was very hesitant to switch to the online model, primarily because 10 years ago, bar prep was a person standing physically in the front of the room lecturing to students, and that's what worked for everyone, right? Well, about 10 years ago, Themis came onto the market. The online piece slowly started trickling into bar prep. And the challenge for me was that students weren't always selecting whether or not to do in person or online based on true self-reflection of whether or not that would be a good fit for them. And so I went into the online learning piece this last year very nervous because, again, with the academic skills portion, I was working with a capture group of students who were already struggling when they were in the classroom. Now they were online on top of it. And so I was really concerned about the fitting life around law school versus fitting law school around life conundrum that a lot of them end up with. And so I was nervous, but I actually came out of it partially loving it because it forced faculty to reimagine their courses, even if they hadn't wanted to and hadn't done so for 10 years. And that was something that was really nice for me. I felt like it did that for me as well. I mean, Kate talked about this earlier. I went through and realized that even though I go through and reevaluate my courses every year and try and add new stuff, I hadn't really reworked my courses in a long time. And I had to rework them to make them fit online. And I found that I was nervous that I wouldn't know my students. And in fact, the one-on-one sessions I had with my students over Zoom were sometimes more impactful, I felt, than they had been in the classroom. I felt like there was a true level of privacy that doesn't feel like it's there sometimes, even in your office with the door closed. That with Zoom, you're in this little bubble, and we connected more because we were so much closer, even though we were so far apart. And so I felt like there was a lot of that was a benefit. The piece that I still walk away with is the same that I did with bar prep. And that is students need to intentionally take this on, and faculty need to intentionally take this on for it to be effective. I think this last year we were all thrown into it, whether we wanted it or not. And for some, it was exciting when they walked out. And for some, they never want to look back at that experience. And I think that it's important to take that into account, both in your learning and in your teaching, because some students might not have the skills to keep themselves on track, to have the time management, and also to reach out for help when they need it, when they're not in a building accidentally walking by your office, the way that they do in the physical classroom. And so I think that it's still important for us to identify who will benefit always from these opportunities, but I'm not as terrified of them anymore. And in fact, I think they were a great opportunity for me as a professor to rework and really rethink why I was doing things. I know this harkens back to our last session, but it really, I think the online teaching forces you to step back and really identify your objectives again and think about how you're delivering them so much more creatively than sometimes we do when we're in a traditional classroom. So I think it's wonderful.
Thank you. Our next question is, what is your most valuable suggestion for someone designing a law school course now that you've designed courses for delivery in different modes or multiple modes? And let's start with Megan.
Hi. Can you see me okay? Okay. Well, thank you. Great question. As I started thinking about this, as I designed a course, taught professional responsibility for the first time online in the spring to 80 students, quite an experience. And now I'm pivoting it to do it in a high flex mode, right? I sort of thought, as much as you can, try to think of ways to organize the course not for a specific delivery mode. What are, start with sort of like a plan. How would some common content and themes, so you kind of have an outline and a plan for the course, and then you can, pivot individual elements or develop individual elements and pieces of it, whether it's going to be online, in person, but think as big picture as you can, because many of us will end up teaching the same courses over and over again. And many of us will refine them and pivot them and teach them in different ways. And I, every semester, I remember I taught an online legal writing class 15 times over the course of several years. And I made little changes every semester, but having a really good sort of base and plan that would work in any environment was crucial. Because if you start with a mindset of like, this is my online course, you might, make some decisions, which would be great for an online course. But then when you go back and revisit it, it's going to be an on-campus course the next time. It might look really differently. So I would say, start with, thinking about how it would work in multiple settings, and then dig down into little pieces that work the best for the particular environment. And also, it's silly stuff, but stuff I have actually been teaching online for 11 years, I think. And I previously worked at an institution that had a huge online program. And when we brought in instructional designers, they said a lot of stuff to me that at first I thought, this doesn't make any sense. And I realized how very right they were, like not dating things, making lectures and assignments and review activities that are evergreen that you can update if you need to, but really, having resources that you can use over and over again. And then if you need to change them, and, chunking lectures, not recording an hour-long video lecture, which I started doing the first time I taught online, only to realize, the something in the middle of that was wrong. So now I have to go back and redo the whole thing. I think, even before the pandemic, I helped design some courses for the Weekend JD program, which we launched at a previous school I worked for. I also found that, being open to things that work in different environments, it might change your mind about how you teach. So for example, several I'd call them very traditional faculty members taught in the Weekend JD program. And once they realized how much they liked flipping the classroom to do it that way, they never went back. So kind of having that open mind of, pieces that work in one, delivery model for a course or your setting might work actually kind of well in another one. You might have to adjust them a little bit, but having that, going into it with that open mind, because you never know what you're going to like about the way you've designed your course and how you deliver it one time.
Thanks, Megan. Veronica, how about you? What now that you've designed courses a couple of different ways, what are your thoughts about designing courses generally?
Thanks, Tracy. So I'm fairly new to legal academia, and now have taught just as many classes online as I have taught in person. But I went to school with online classes, since the high school level. I've had social media since it started, and I would say 2004, 2005. So I've had this sort of tech in my personal life, and then also through education, but found, during law school that there wasn't a ton. So I think really what I've discovered is that tech, the theme basically is that tech should be a deliberate choice, right? Technology in the classroom should be part of the pedagogy. It should be thought out, and we should be mindful about that, as other panelists have said. So I think, yes, we need to be evidence-based. We need to be based on adult learning theory. We also need to be outcome-centered. But I'm going to add a fourth thing, which is that we should also be student-centered. And I think we can build on the skills that students already have, skills that they've already been building throughout their lives, personal lives, educational lives, and then do that so that we can help them scaffold these skills into something more complex for when they get into practice. So prior to teaching, I also worked in a big law firm, and we used a lot of tools like discovery management software. Obviously, e-filing is now required in most jurisdictions. Many people have had to do oral argument virtually, tagging documents in databases, things like that. So those are tools that students will eventually have to use. So I think law school can be this sort of bridge between personal life and lower education, and also the future workforce. Two ways to do that is to think about what kinds of tools they have in their personal lives, right? Many students have online banking, obviously social media. There are lots of things like that. In addition, many students are also using learning management systems at the undergraduate level. And so I looked up research about what kinds of programs students are using in undergrad, because then that sort of lowers the learning curve in terms of by the time they get to law school. And what I found is that at the undergraduate level, almost 37% use Canvas, 27% use Legacy Blackboard, which is the older Blackboard, and then 16% use Moodle. And that doesn't actually line up with what law schools are using. There was an informal poll through Cali during their boot camp last summer, and majority of people were using Twin, and then Canvas, and then others were not using anything at all. So I think we can also, build on those skills, LMS skills, also technology in personal lives. Thanks.
Thanks, Veronica. Audrey, so what's your most valuable suggestion for someone designing a course?
So I think one thing that was really highlighted when we moved online was the wide variation in contexts and life circumstances of our students. And a number of our panelists have mentioned that over the day. So things like concerns about whether to insist students have their cameras on and reveal their personal spaces, whether our students have access to quiet workspaces and adequate internet bandwidth, whether students had care responsibility for children or sick family members. All of this stuff became really salient. And in response to that salience, many law faculties and law professors design their courses and their policies to provide more flexibility, support, and care for their students. And so my most valuable suggestion to someone designing a law course now, regardless of the mode, is to remember these lessons. So build in different options for assignments. If you want to have a paper, maybe students can have an option of 3 short papers or 1 longer paper. There can maybe be a paper option or an exam option, or choice in topics or format. Can provide, this is I think a really important lesson, provide different ways for students to participate or engage in the course. So allowing students to contribute to the course by submitting questions in advance or summaries after class. Instead of just speaking up during class, I think a lot of us realize that having a back channel so students could contribute in writing instead of sort of breaking into the conversation really allowed us to hear from students that we hadn't heard from before. And just to ensure that there are ways for students who are ill or who have work or care responsibilities to catch up if they have to miss a course. So, recording a course if that's appropriate, and maybe building in a free pass here and there. So if students have a weekly assignment, maybe they have to submit 10 of 12 as the course requirement, or allowing them to pass if on being called on once or twice in a semester, or providing flexible due dates if it's feasible. But I think the most important piece of advice I have is to seek feedback from your students as you go along. So having them submit a 1-minute paper once a week describing the most important thing they've learned and what questions are still remaining, sending out a mid-course survey that they can fill in anonymously to tell you what's working in the course and what isn't working in the course. I think those are practices lots of us have adopted and have been incredibly valuable and will continue to be. So I guess above all, my advice is to say, send your students the message that you expect a lot from them, but that you'll also support them in meeting those expectations.
Thanks, Audrey. Carrie, what about you?
Thanks, Tracy. I think mine is going to be very similar to Megan's. I recommend strongly to anybody with a class that they're going to design for the first time or going back into a new mode of delivery, maybe back in the classroom, is to put your course into a content map. I had a big, extensive content map I was using for developing an asynchronous class in our master's program prior to the pandemic that I am going to go back and map every course I teach into it, partly because it will allow me to move between modes of instruction. And I appreciate some of the flexibility for myself and the students that comes with kind of online delivery modes. But then it allows me to see, like right now I am teaching an asynchronous version and a live version of a course. So I can see what, at a glance, what will work well between the different modes. But I think too, we've all learned new activities and new technologies that we like, and it'll be a lot easier, I think, to bring these back into the classroom if you can just kind of map it out and see where it will work, where it won't, make sure you have a proper workload for students as well as yourself for providing feedback. And I think it allows me, when I'm using one of these, to be a little bit more flexible too, as I'm noticing that we're having a slowdown with a difficult concept. I can kind of look at the next several classes at once and kind of see what I can tweak going forward with that. And kind of related to that, if you kind of go back and map it, if it's not something you normally do, I don't know about where you all work. I imagine you got streams of emails from all of the experts on your campus that were very willing to show you how to incorporate new things, active learning or technology into your classroom. And if you have a content map, you might be able to identify a couple of key areas where it would make sense for you to proactively reach out to some of those experts you're now aware of so that you can incorporate new learning activities that kind of go beyond discussion and Socratic method into your courses. And I found it to be a way to allow me to be more prepared and more flexible all at the same time.
Thanks, Carrie. That's fantastic. Our final question, and then we will open it up to questions from you all. So start typing your questions in that Q&A, whether it's about a specific technique, a problem you ran into designing your course, or a follow-up on some of what's been said here. It sounds like we could have a nice brief conversation about making PowerPoint a little bit easier to use online. Our final question is, what is your best tip for fostering collaboration and community in online courses, regardless of the mode? So you can talk about one that that covers all of the modes, or one that's specific to a particular mode that you think is really important. And we're going to start with Veronica.
So this is going to be sort of anticlimactic, and I apologize in advance. But my chapter is about learning management systems. I have a really handy basic chart that compares the 4 major ones and features of each one, if anybody is interested in that. And there are tons of tools, many of which many of you are already aware that exist. Peer review tools, there are discussion boards, live chats, collaborative documents, breakout rooms, et cetera, et cetera. But my best tip is actually that we should not encourage too much interaction in the online world, that we should actually foster and encourage more in-person social skill building. And the reason I say that is because, students, we have to be mindful really of the toxicity of technology through, for example, on-demand things that people will continue to access after hours, so to speak, when they should be resting or spending time with family or whatever they want to do. We have to be mindful of Zoom fatigue. Obviously, having too much screen time can affect sleep patterns. It can inhibit executive functioning throughout the day. And then we also want to be mindful of just overloading students, so that they're on the computer all day long. So I think to the extent we can foster more in-person connection, either organic, social skill building, networking, things like that, or, more formal group projects, team-based learning, I think we should.
Fantastic. Carrie, what about you?
My tip would be to put yourself in your student's shoes, which I know we all try to do often anyways, but it's as simple as just making sure if whatever your community building activity is, if it's a discussion board, if you're trying to get them to use technology you've integrated in your LMS, does it work? So to put it in student view, get somebody to test it. I know we had trouble trying to integrate Flipgrid, which I know many people have, but we just could not get it to work. And so we ended up dropping it and using a debate platform called Kialo, which I think actually achieved our outcomes for the class much better than just trying to get everybody's face into the class in another way. But I also kind of bring it back to, I was very fortunate to attend a master's program that was online, synchronous, almost a decade ago. But I do feel like some of the community aspects that you get from in person didn't quite make it into that classroom, even though it was synchronous. And so I've designed primarily asynchronous classes. And so I try to take what I've learned from being a student and put it in there. It's nice to have an introduction discussion board. And I always put the first post in there to kind of set the tone and provide options for students so that they're not uncomfortable with anything I'm asking. I add non-academic components of discussion boards, icebreaker posts that students can participate in. Some of them build over a couple of weeks. I might have them make some sort of image of what does this lesson remind you of? Draw an image, post it, or find one, and then we'll vote on it, where they're getting points so that they're doing it. But we have kind of this like low stakes way to engage with each other so that it's easier than when I want them to work on a group assignment or debate an issue in a discussion board, that they have that community. They see everybody as individuals. So hopefully they don't even need the community guidelines I've provided, but are able to just go from there and engage in an appropriate manner with one another on these issues. And I think kind of related to putting yourself in the student's shoes is if you are asynchronous, make sure you're appearing in the course often enough. Put your image into your profile so they always see you. Make sure you're giving recorded and written feedback so that they can kind of feel that connection to you. And I think I always have and will have an extra discussion board. Sometimes I come up with creative names. Often I'll just have it be the general board where we can post anything related to the course or kind of what's going on. And I've had students, as long as I'm in there in that space, who really take advantage of that and kind of lead a social component of the course, even in an asynchronous format. So my tip, put yourself in your student's shoes.
Thanks, Carrie. That's a great one. One thing that I learned how to do this year, and I don't know what I'm going to do, and my daughters are too old for me to relate to, early young adults. But I noticed that my daughters communicate with all of their friends through WhatsApp or GroupMe. And so I started, I gave my students the choice in each section. Do you want WhatsApp or do you want GroupMe? And I used that when we did breakout rooms, so that everybody could communicate with everybody at the same time while we were in the breakout room, which was really helpful. What I didn't anticipate was they would use it for everything. And so they were more likely to use the GroupMe or the WhatsApp than the all the things that I had set up that I thought would be so useful for them. They liked the text boards. And so I was like, okay, fine, we'll just fly in the teeth of it. You can use it for whatever you want to use it for. And so that was great. Anne, what are your tips for your best tip for community building?
My very best one, my favorite one, is role-playing simulations. I did not make this up. I took it from my experience as a law student at CUNY Law School back in the 1980s. I'm dating myself. I won't say 80 what. But anyway, in our first year at CUNY, we were taught almost right from the start in role-playing simulations. I adapted this for synchronous learning probably 8 years ago now at Toro. using breakout rooms. And the reason I love it for synchronous, and you can also do it for asynchronous, but I'll talk about synchronous right now. The reason I love it is that my students, I did it in law practice management. My students mostly did not know each other. It was a fairly small class, around 15 students. And in this case, they were all on the screen. They could see each other, but they didn't know each other, and they all stared in the first class. And it's, they're even more isolated when they can't see each other. But I put them into breakout rooms, and I said, we're going to have fun now. This is, you're not your typical law school learning experience, but you'll be learning. And I told them that we were going to be starting by naming the law firm. And they all were like, yeah, this is easy. I said, no. I want you to learn. These are the skills you're going to learn. But you're also going to get to know each other. You're going to learn how to collaborate, and you're going to make friends for life, which is actually what happens when you do role playing. And the trick is that I gave the students last names, so they could not be themselves. And I gave them personalities, and I gave them scenarios. And anyone who wants to know details of this, contact me offline. I'll put my contact information in the chat. But basically, it's like playing when you're kids. You're no longer you. So even the shyest students, and I was one of those students years ago. I didn't like speaking up in class. Now you can't shut me up, but I'm older. So I've learned. But even the shyest students, they blossom when they're in these breakout rooms of 3 or 4 students. They have a different personality, a different last name. I give them 30 minutes to figure out what to name the firm. And it has to be a firm with 4 names in order. Whose name goes first? Sounds easy. It's not. I tell them to argue with each other, but to be respectful. And, even though you're not really you, be respectful. In the end, each group has to report to the class. And also there's a separate reflection. I call it a debriefing exercise, only because when I was in law school, I didn't like being told to reflect. That's my own baggage, because I reflect all the time. The only thing that's graded is that debriefing exercise. It's guided. Again, I'm happy to provide it to anybody offline. There are a bunch of questions, and then they have to write an essay of 450 words with the questions. I do not grade the part when they're together, but students, so the one, and I do this in the first class, I do another one in the second class, I do a different one in the third class, 30 minutes each. Students later tell me they make friends for life. It's an amazing icebreaker. They also learn that it's not so easy to set up a law firm. But the one with the naming, I purposely set it up so at least one group will choose this order of names. The names are Mahl, M-A-H-L, Parr, P-A-R-R, Actus, A-C-T-U-S, and Moore, M-O-O-R-E. And if you choose that order and you say it fast, it's malpractice and more. So when you answer the phone, it's malpractice and more. And I did this for the faculty at a faculty lunch years ago, and 2 different groups didn't even think and chose malpractice and more. And we have a good laugh over it, so I become more human to my students, and it breaks the ice. So that's my very best favorite tip. Thanks.
I think I was in the group that ordered things so that our acronym for our firm was CRAP.
You were, Tracy. I didn't want to say that. Provost Salkin was in the group that realized the malpractice and more.
Megan, how do you build collaboration and community?
Sure, great question. I think I start by really trying to set the standard for community in terms of being available to my students in lots of different ways. It's a little different in an asynchronous class, but in both kind of an online synchronous and on campus, showing up a little early and or staying a little late, and if I'm able to, inviting students to pop in and ask questions. In addition to office hours, I always have an attendance sheet where they can, leave a question for me that I either address in class or address with them individually. Just trying to model different ways of really talking to them and being available to them. I also try to make collaborating both a requirement and an option, if that makes sense. So I have some things in every form of course that I've taught where they're expected to interact with each other on a discussion board or in class where they're working together, even if it's just working through some hypotheticals and mixing up, the groups for that, but then also creating some optional ways. And I've seen professors do some fun stuff. I remember a torts professor having sort of a tort spotting discussion board, just as like a fun way, once you start to realize what torts are, if you see them, things that are torts in the news. And I think I'm thinking of doing something similar for my PR class, this fall, sort of, there are a lot of professional responsibility and legal ethics things in the news lately. So as a way to sort of, get students, thinking and spotting things and commenting to each other. So kind of having the required piece where I force them to work together, but then also some optional pieces so that they're able to collaborate as they'd like. But I try to also, I have a very casual teaching style, and I try to, start class with a lot of jokes. And I always have a funny kind of a question on my attendance sheet with like a goofy answer that gets them sort of commenting and laughing. And, sort of, I try to just start class on a really conversational note, because I think, it just makes them comfortable. I think they want to feel comfortable collaborating, that things are low stakes and supposed to be fun. And when they do breakout groups, I don't actually usually go in and spy on them. I know that some people do. I kind of just let them have the time. And I figure if they end up a little off topic in the hypothetical and they're talking about other stuff, that's fine too, especially in Zoom school that we've been doing, for so long. If those are the chances they have to collaborate and share it, even if it's not exactly on topic, that's fine with me.
Thanks, Megan. One thing that I did in the spring and in my summer class that just ended is I'd start the class sometimes. I'd always start with some kind of icebreaker, a really quick one. But one of my favorites and one of their favorites was One Gotta Go. And you can find these all over the internet. It's like a series of 4 or 5 pictures around a theme, like in like a panel display, like a photo lineup. And they got to pick one that they would do without forever. So an example is, one is breakfast foods. And so you've got muffins, waffles, pancakes, and something else. I can't remember. And you have to choose which one's got to go. And those start some really fun conversations at the beginning. And I learned a lot about my students' bad and wrong ideas about pancakes. So we had a couple of questions. The first one is, Carrie, could you talk a little bit more about what a content map is?
Yes. I can put a link into chat for everyone too, but what it does is it lets you look at it by class or by week. It's really up to you how you want to think about it. But then you can list out the topics that you want to cover in that class. What are the outcomes that you need to achieve? And does this match to your overall learning outcomes for the class? And then you can really get into the fine details of, what are students going to read? Or is there a podcast? What are they going to do first before they then, if it's an online one, you could be what lectures, you may still have lectures in a traditional class, but it could just be discussion points as well. And you kind of just figure out what are the learning activities that you're going to have students engage in? What do they have to turn in? Is there going to be any sort of formative or summative assessment going? And you can just kind of see it in this giant spreadsheet that we have. I guess it becomes more giant as you start filling it in. But it allows you, particularly with the assessments, I think, to see, am I assessing something too often? And then what sort of feedback am I going to be required to give off of this? Do I have it built into my LMS? Are they doing peer review? Or is this something that's going to take me a long time, if it's like an essay, to really give a lot of individualized feedback on, so that you can adjust their workload and yours? I think for moving between formats, it lets you see what you already have that you can take with you and what you might need to modify. And does that answer everybody's question enough?
I think that's excellent information. And I just popped up on my own screen real fast to make sure that I could find the content map information and the link you provided in the chat. And it looks like that's some great information from University of Utah. And so, yeah, I'll definitely be doing a Google search on content map later. One of the other questions was about addressing Zoom fatigue. And Veronica, I know that you put some resources in the chat about that, but could you talk a little bit about how you address and help students address just the fatigue of online learning? And also, if I could add my own little bit in there, we've gotten into, I think, what is a dangerous habit, which is the 24/7 workday. It's very convenient to work from home. And so what I find now is, those of us who are on 9 and 10-month contracts, we had to work through the summer last summer, and I certainly understood why. But my law school is scheduling events every week this summer, and I don't get paid for that. And so I'm happy to do it, but I'd like a 12-month contract and to be compensated that way. And particularly for, the women who are often compensated less handsomely than the men on faculties, this additional summer burden where we also bear additional childcare responsibilities it seems really dangerous. So Veronica, could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I'm certainly not an expert in this by any means, but I thought about incorporating it into my ethics class when I was talking about mental health. Obviously, lawyers suffer from a lot of mental health concerns related to the stress of the profession. And so I share research with students about chronic stress, the impact on our physical body, our brain health. I also shared in the chat a recent article that discusses why Zoom fatigue happens from a psychological perspective. And so I also, try to recognize the signs in students when I feel like maybe they're fatigued for whatever reason, and ask if they need any resources. One thing I did as a concrete tool is I switched from video lectures at one point to audio lectures, because I noticed in Canvas that students were listening to the audio or downloading the transcript more than they were watching the video. And that was helpful for me because I didn't have to get ready and have a great background. I could be in my closet where the sound was a lot better because there were clothes around me. And the students really enjoyed that because it was also less work for them. And I think we see that also in the public with this resurgence of, podcasts. People are very interested in podcasts more so maybe than video conferencing, because you can be on a walk, you can be doing dishes, other things while you're listening. So I think there's something to be said about both types in terms of learning theory. But I think particularly in the online format, we have to just be very conscious of how much technology we're requiring our students to use, keeping in mind that it's also very necessary for everyday life, for banking, for, finding a restaurant or communicating with family members who live across the country. I always give the example of my mom, when she got home from work, she would literally pull out the newspaper and open it and read the news and then relax, right? Maybe watch a half-hour news program. But for me, I have news updates coming to my work email, to my personal email. I also have, text messages to check, maybe also some messages on this Canvas platform. So there's just a lot of channels at once in ways that have not really been studied in terms of our executive functioning, our brain health, our body health. So I think it's just really important to be aware and keep up to date on the research related to that, particularly as it affects particular groups such as women or people of color.
Thanks, Veronica. That's fantastic. One of the things I wanted to mention is that Vicki Sutton put a link to her newest research that's on SSRN, in which she asked students about a lot of this information about how they feel about, online learning and Zoom fatigue and things like that. And one of the results that she reports was surprising to her, and certainly surprising to me when I heard it, was that students want more online offerings. So, I think that the Zoom fatigue that we experience may be a little different than what they experience, but also, we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because there's Zoom fatigue doesn't mean we need to shut it all down and go back to pen and paper for everything. And Veronica, one of your comments where you said that, some of the students like just the audio from the lecture is that it's so easy. And I think someone mentioned this in the previous panel about giving, I think Susan mentioned it, about giving different modes for students to access the information. So if you have a video lecture, if they can download the audio, see closed captioning on the video, and also download a script, that gives them a ton of options so that they can get the information, the way that works best for them and their lives. And so I've really appreciated learning so much this year about how little I knew about their lives, So any last thoughts? I will say one thing before I cede the floor for last thoughts. I've read each of these chapters, I don't know how many times, 4 or 5 at least. And I learn something new every time I read the chapters. This panel was one of my primary sections. Tessa and I, both read the whole book many, many times, but this was one of my primary sections. So I really read these chapters with a fine-tooth comb and got something different every single time. And throughout the panel, I've been furiously scribbling new ideas that I've heard. So thank you all for bringing this wealth of ideas and information and research and suggestions to us. It's just, I don't know that I'll ever get to the bottom of everything that's in the book, but I can't wait. I can't wait to have it physically on my desk so I can use it. Anybody have any parting thoughts that they didn't share yet?
So I see that there's a question from Amy that talks about duplicating the chat function. And I think Tessa may have some thoughts on that too. This is something I've been looking at, particularly when you think about, adding to the richness and the diversity in the classroom. I loved that chat allowed me at times to elevate questions from students who might not otherwise speak up. So one of the things that I noticed, and it's a poor substitute, so I'm really interested in any other ideas on this, but I had used that attendance sheet that I talked about in chat, where at the end of class, instead of just saying, sign your name if you're present, I had a Google form and I had students say, tell me one thing in class you didn't understand. So I was able, at least in that way, not in real time, but at least at the beginning of the next class, able to elevate the voices of some students who had great ideas but not otherwise speak up in class. That's one thing I have. And Tessa may have some other thoughts on this, or many of you may have.
I'll say that I'm going to use, I haven't decided how, I don't know how this is going to work yet, but I would like to have the ability for students to type questions and not comments, because that's going to get tedious and difficult to manage, but to type questions throughout the in-person class. And what I'm thinking about doing is maybe having open on my, on the podium desktop, WhatsApp or GroupMe or something where they can ask questions without being identified. And so I can say, like I've done the last 16 months, okay, so we've got a question now about X, and I can address that question. And so, I have struggled, and I think I'm softening in my old age with kind of holding students' feet to the fire on being able to speak out loud in class, in public, and remembering that they are young and they are 1Ls, and they've got 2 years of classes after they are finished with my class. We don't have to eat the whole elephant in the first semester. And so, I have come to, and you guys have all helped me with your chapters, with the panel idea, with everything I've heard this year, that, we can be a lot more gentle with them and trust the process of law school. I'm always telling students to trust the process, and I've trusted it exactly that much. So trusting the process a little bit more. So thank you all for your time, for your ideas, for your generosity.